Okay, Federalist number 6, concerning dangers from dissensions between the states. Finally, John Jay has now gotten sick. We don't care about him anymore. We're just getting based writings from author Alexander Hamilton. The 3 last numbers of this paper have been dedicated to an enumeration of the dangers to which we should be exposed in a state of disunion from the arms and arts of foreign nations. I shall now proceed to delineate dangers of a different and perhaps still more alarming kind, those which will, in all probability, flow from dissensions between the states themselves and from domestic factions and convulsions. These have been already, in some instances, slightly anticipated, but they deserve a more particular and more full investigation. A man must be far gone in utopian speculations who can seriously doubt that, if these states should either be wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies, the subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other. To presume a want of motives for such contests as an argument against their existence would be to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. To look for a continuation of harmony between a number of independent, unconnected sovereignties in the same neighborhood would be to disregard the uniform course of human events and to set at defiance the accumulated experience of ages. So basically saying, obviously, if you get a bunch of territories that live right next to each other, these people are going to go to war with each other, they're going to fight for resources, there's going to be differences between them, like it always happens. It's always happened in history, it will continue to happen in history, right? The causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. There are some which have a general and almost constant operation upon the collective bodies of society. Of this description are the love of power, or the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, or the desire of equality and safety. There are others which have a more circumscribed, though an equally operative influence within their spheres. Such are the rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations. And there are others, not less numerous than either of the former, which take their origin entirely in private passions, in the attachments, enmities, interests, hopes, and fears of leading individuals in the communities of which they are members. Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have in too many instances abused the confidence they possessed, and assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage or personal gratification. Basically, tons of people will go to war for tons of reasons. This is just always a thing in human history, right? The celebrated Pericles, in compliance with the resentment of a prostitute, at the expense of much of the blood and treasure of his countrymen, attacked, vanquished, and destroyed the city of the Samnians. The same man, stimulated by private pique against the Megarensians? I don't know how to pronounce this shit. Another nation of Greece, or to avoid a prosecution with which he was threatened as an accomplice of a supposed theft of the statuary Phidias, or to get rid of the accusations prepared to be brought against him for dissipating the funds of the state in the purchase of popularity, or from a combination of all these causes, was the primitive author of that famous and fatal war, distinguished in the Grecian annals by the name of the Peloponnesian War, which, after various vicissitudes, intermissions, and renewals, terminated in the ruin of the Athenian Commonwealth. Christ.
Vicissitude.
A change of circumstances or fortune. Let's see. Hamilton begins by laying out all the different ways that neighboring nations have come to compete and fight with each other in the past. The ambitious cardinal, who was prime minister to Henry VIII, permitting his vanity to aspire to the triple crown, entertained hopes of succeeding in the acquisition of that splendid prize by the influence of the Emperor Charles V. To secure the favor and interest of this enterprising and powerful monarch, he precipitated England into a war with France, contrary to the plainest dictates of policy, and at the hazard of the safety and independence, as well of the kingdom over which he presided by his counsels, as of Europe in general. For if there ever was a sovereign who bid fair to realize the project of universal monarchy, it was the Emperor Charles V, of whose intrigues Wolsey was at once the instrument and the dupe. Obviously, going over history of conflicts and all this, I guess people at the time would have been more familiar with this. Maybe you guys are familiar with this. I'm not, because history is cringe. I'm just kidding. I just haven't studied this. The influence which the bigotry of one female, the petulance of another, and the cabals of a third had in the contemporary policy, ferments, and pacifications of a considerable part of Europe are topics that have been too often descanted upon not to be generally known. To multiply examples of the agency of personal considerations and the production of great national events, either foreign or domestic, according to their direction, would be an unnecessary waste of time. Those who have but a superficial acquaintance with the sources from which they are to be drawn will themselves recollect a variety of instances, and those who have a tolerable knowledge of human nature will not stand in need of such lights to form their opinion either of the reality or extent of that agency. It's basically self-evident that, human history is full of conflict with one another for good reasons and bad reasons, basically. Perhaps, however, a reference tending to illustrate the general principle may with propriety be made to a case which has lately happened among ourselves. If Shays had not been a desperate debtor, it is much to be doubted whether Massachusetts would have been plunged into a civil war. This is a reference to Shays' Rebellion, I believe, right? A violent uprising in Massachusetts from 86 to 87. Okay. So we are aware of this because it was part of our insurrection research, right? Oh, so this is a real life example. So he's basically saying people go to war and do conflict for all sorts of crazy personal and public reasons and all dumb things, right? And here's an example. Shays' Rebellion, I imagine, would be fresh in people's minds. This guy, part of the rebellion, was probably instigated by the fact that he was severely in debt. Right, so he's giving a real life example. This has already happened in the newly formed colonies and the newly formed Confederation of States. Yeah. But notwithstanding the concurring testimony or experience, in this particular, there are still to be found visionary or designing men who stand ready to advocate the paradox of perpetual peace between the states, though dismembered and alienated from each other. He's referring to people that will still try to make the argument that, wow, having 4 different confederacies is going to be better. Yeah. But now, okay, we're continuing on this. The genius of republics, say they, is pacific. The spirit of commerce has a tendency to soften the manners of men and to extinguish those inflammable humors which have so often kindled into wars. Commercial republics like ours will never be disposed to waste themselves in ruinous contentions with each other. They will be governed by mutual interest and will cultivate a spirit of mutual amity and concord. Okay, so he's saying this is what the anti-federalists are arguing. They think that, well, just because we trade, that means just because that we trade with each other, we'll never go to war with each other. He's attacking these people, basically. Is it not, we may ask these projectors in politics, the true interest of all nations to cultivate the same benevolent and philosophic spirit? If this be their true interest, have they in fact pursued it? Has it not, on the contrary, invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interest have a more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice? Have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? Are not the former administered by men as well as the latter? Are there not aversions, predilections, rivalships, and desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations as well as kings? Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the impulses of rage, resentment, jealousy, avarice, and of other irregular and violent propensities? Is it not well known that their determinations are often governed by a few individuals in whom they place confidence and are, of course, liable to be tinctured by the passions and views of those individuals? Has commerce hitherto done anything more than change the objects of war? Is not the love of wealth as domineering and enterprising a passion as that of power or glory? Have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives since that has become the prevailing system of nations, as were before occasioned by the cupidity of territory or dominion? Has not the spirit of commerce in many instances administered new incentives to the appetite, both for the one and for the other? Let experience, the least fallible guide of human opinions, be appealed to for an answer to these inquiries. So saying that obviously, listen, like nations have been trading with each other for a long time, republics have existed, they still go to war with each other. He argues against the idea that commerce alone would dissuade nations from warring with each other, as they continue to do so up to that day. Okay, sorry. Sparta, Athens, Rome, and Carthage were all republics. Two of them, Athens and Carthage, of the commercial kind, yet they as often engaged in wars, offensive and defensive, as the neighboring monarchies of the same times. Sparta was little better than a well-regulated camp, and Rome was never sated of carnage and conquest. Carthage, though a commercial republic, was the aggressor in the very war that ended in her destruction. Hannibal had carried her arms into the heart of Italy and to the gates of Rome before Scipio, in turn gave him an overthrow in the territories of Carthage and made a conquest of the Commonwealth. I should save like notable quotes. It's Scipio. Venice, in later times, figured more than once in wars of ambition, till, becoming an object to the other Italian states, Pope Julius II found means to accomplish that formidable league, which gave a deadly blow to the power and pride of this haughty republic. The provinces of Holland, till they were overwhelmed in debts and taxes, took a leading and conspicuous part in the wars of Europe. They had furious contests with England for the dominion of the sea and were among the most persevering and most implacable, of the opponents of Louis XIV. In the government of Britain, the representatives of the people compose one branch of the national legislature. Commerce has been for ages the predominant pursuit of that country. Few nations, nevertheless, have been more frequently engaged in war, and the wars in which the kingdom has been engaged have, in numerous instances, proceeded from the people. There have been, if I may so express it, almost as many popular as royal wars. The cries of the nation and the importunities of their representatives have, upon various occasions, dragged their monarchs into war or continued them in it contrary to their inclinations and sometimes contrary to the real interests of the state. In that memorable struggle for superiority between the rival houses of Austria and Bourbon, which so long kept Europe in a flame, it is well known that the antipathies of the English against the French, seconding the ambition, or rather the avarice, of a favorite leader, protracted the war beyond the limits marked out by sound policy, and for a considerable time in opposition to the views of the court. All of these things, obviously all of these are just examples of like, hey, if we have like different confederacies, we're going to war with each other. Like it's going to happen. It's just... like, we're always going to fight. People fight. Whether we're republics, monarchies, whether we're trade-based or whatever, like, people fight. We always fight. The wars of these two last-mentioned nations have, in a great measure, grown out of commercial considerations, the desire of supplanting and the fear of being supplanted, either in particular branches of traffic or in the general advantages of trade and navigation. One of the things that's interesting here, I wish I had this quote earlier, is I argued a long time ago with a libertarian guy in 2018, maybe. He might have been he wasn't the leader of the Libertarian Party, but I think he was a big guy in the Libertarian Party. And his argument was for World War II, we should have never interfered. We should have just traded with everybody because a trade empire never goes to war. These would have been good arguments if I had read the Federalist Papers. I would have had good arguments against this. Or I could have given like, well, here's the historical arguments that were made historically about trade empires never engaging in war and that it absolutely happens. Yeah. Was it Larry Sharp? Yes, it was. It was him. From this summary of what has taken place in other countries, whose situations have borne the nearest resemblance to our own, what reason can we have to confide in those reveries which would seduce us into an expectation of peace and cordiality between the members of the present Confederacy in a state of separation? Have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of those idle theories which have amused us with promises of an exemption from the imperfections, weaknesses, and evils incident to society in every shape? Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as the other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue? Basically saying, like, this is a pipe dream. This is never going to happen, that we're all peaceful with each other. Let the point of extreme depression to which our national dignity and credit have sunk, let the inconveniences felt everywhere from a lax and ill administration of government, let the revolt of a part of the state of North Carolina, the late menacing disturbances in Pennsylvania, and the actual insurrections and rebellions in Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion, declare. So far is the general sense of mankind from corresponding with the tenets of those who endeavor to lull asleep our apprehensions of discord and hostility between the states in the event of disunion, that it has from long observation of the progress of society become a sort of axiom in politics that vicinity or nearness of situation constitutes national natural enemies. If you're near each other, you will always fight, basically, right? An intelligent writer expresses himself on this subject using as many slurs as possible on Twitter. An intelligent writer expresses himself on this subject to this effect. Neighboring nations, says he, are naturally enemies of each other unless their common weakness forces them to league in a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences that neighborhood occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which dispossesses all states to aggrandize themselves at the expense of their neighbors. This passage, at the same time, points out the evil and suggests the remedy. What does it say, quote from? From Principles des Négociations. Looks like French. Cringe. Is a book by Gabriel Bonnet de Mobley, that was first published in 1757. The book covers topics such as international trade, modern warfare, diplomacy, and the role of ambassadors. Cute. Doesn't this contradict the claim that globalism prevents wars? No, I don't think so. I think having deeper integrations with people always leads to less fighting. This is arguing for superstructures that keep people from fighting with one another. You could argue that a form of like a multilateral trade agreement or things like the United Nations or whatever. Keep in mind that like these big superstructures like the UN or the EU, none of these things existed at the time that this was being written, but all these arguments would probably be used in they would be used in support of those types of superstructures, basically. You skipped a paragraph. Wait, where? This one? No. You trolled me. Fuck you. You trolled me. Federalist number 7. The same subject continued concerning dangers from dissensions between the states. It is sometimes asked, with an air of seeming triumph, what inducements... Okay, this word was the word of the week. I think if I control F induce, I bet I'm going to see it over 100 fucking times between these 10 Federalist papers. They love this word. Okay, never mind. Okay, John Jay was just obsessed with this word. I'm so sorry. I assumed Hamilton was as well. My bad, whatever. John Jay writes it a lot. Hamilton doesn't. He only does one time. Fuck you. Okay. I didn't pre-read. I'm sorry. The states within the limits of whose colonial governments they were comprised have claimed them as their property. The others have contended that the rights of the crown in this article devolved upon the Union. especially as to all that parts. Wait, hold on. The states within the limits of those of whose colonial governments they were comprised have claimed them as their property. The others have contended that the rights of the crown in this article devolved upon the Union, especially as to all that part of the Western Territory which, either by actual possession or through the submission of the Indian proprietors, was subjected to the jurisdiction of the King of Great Britain till it was relinquished in the Treaty of Peace. Oh, that there are competing claims for. It is sometimes asked, with an air of seeming triumph, what inducements could the states have, if disunited, to make war upon each other? Bro, we get it. How many times are you going to argue this? Wait, did we just do this? No, it's the same shit. I guess it says the same subject continued. Okay, whatever. It would be a full answer to this question to say precisely the same inducements which have at different times deluged in blood all the nations in the world. But unfortunately for us, the question admits of a more particular answer. There are causes of differences within our immediate contemplation of the tendency of which, even under the restraints of a federal constitution, we have had sufficient experience to enable us to form a judgment of what might be expected if those restraints were removed. Territorial disputes have, at all times, been found one of the most fertile sources of hostility among nations. Perhaps the greatest proportion of wars that have desolated the earth have sprung from this origin. This cause would exist among us in full force. We have a vast tract of unsettled territory within the boundaries of the United States. There still are discordant and undecided claims between several of them, and the dissolution of the Union would lay a foundation for similar claims between them all. It is well known that they have heretofore had serious and animated discussion concerning the rights to the lands which were ungranted at the time of the Revolution, and which usually went under the name of Crown lands. Actually, here's a question. I have no idea what the answer is. Is the territory of the 13 colonies, did any of those state borders change after the colonies were founded, were like the Articles of Confederation versus like the States of America, like the federal government was formed? Did the borders of these colonies like ever change much, or? Yes. Oh, okay. Apparently they have. West Virginia carved out of Virginia. Vermont seceded from New York, and Virginia and North Carolina CT had disputed boundaries out west. What's the purpose of this question? Of what question? I was just curious. Or, well, who actually is right when deciding who the land was assigned to, basically. Okay. This, it has been said, was at all events an acquisition to the Confederacy by compact with a foreign power. It has been the prudent policy of Congress to appease this controversy by prevailing upon the states to make concessions to the United States for the benefit of the whole. This has been so far accomplished as, under a continuation of the Union, to afford a decided prospect of an amicable termination of the dispute. A dismemberment of the Confederacy, however, would revive this dispute and would create others on the same subject. At present, a large part of the vacant Western territory is, by cession at least, if not by any anterior right, the common property of the Union. If that were at an end, the states which made the cession on a principle of federal compromise would be apt, when the motive of the grant has ceased, to reclaim the lands as a reversion. The other states would no doubt insist on a proportion by right of representation. Their argument would be that a grant, once made, could not be revoked, and that the justice of participating in territory acquired or secured by the joint efforts of the Confederacy remained undiminished. If, contrary to probability, it should be admitted by all the states that each had a right to a share of this common stock, there would still be a difficulty to be surmounted as to a proper rule of apportionment. Different principles would be set up by different states for this purpose, and as they would affect the opposite interests of the parties, they might not easily be susceptible to of a pacific adjustment. So basically saying like they've already kind of like apportioned out a lot of the territory based on the union that they had, and if the Articles of Confederation were to dissolve and everybody be individual states or for different unions, like how the fuck are they going to go back and decide, well, who actually gets what based on the land that they all acquired, as part of a confederated states? Bolton argues in this essay that doling out land that was apportioned under the current union in the absence of another union would be impossible and would lead to conflict. You have no real positions and don't have the facts. You just make up convincing arguments. Destiny. Okay. True. In the wide field of Western territory, therefore, we perceive an ample theater for hostile pretensions without any umpire or common judge to interpose between the contending parties. To reason from the past to the future, we shall have good ground to apprehend that the sword would sometimes be appealed to as the arbiter of their differences. If people disagree enough, they're going to fight over it. The circumstances of the dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania, respecting the land of Wyoming, admonish us not to be sanguine in expecting an easy accommodation of such differences. The Articles of Confederation obliged the parties to submit the matter to the decision of a federal court. The submission was made, and the court decided in favor of Pennsylvania. But Connecticut gave strong indications of dissatisfaction with that determination, nor did she appear to be entirely resigned to it till, by negotiation and management, something like an equivalent was found for the loss she supposed herself to have sustained. Nothing here said is intended to convey the slightest censure on the conduct of that state. She no doubt sincerely believed herself to have been injured by the decision, and states, like individuals, acquiesce with great reluctance in determinations to their disadvantage. Just talking about a disagreement two states have and how it was settled by the federal government. Those who had an opportunity of seeing the inside of the transactions which attended the progress of the controversy between this state and the District of Vermont can vouch the opposition we experienced, as well from states not interested as from those which were interested in the claim, and can attest the danger to which the peace of the Confederacy might have been exposed had this state attempted to assert its right by force. Obviously, if we would have fought, there would have been a big fight, because they would have fought. Two motives prepondered in that opposition. One, a jealousy entertained of our future power, and the other, the interest of certain individuals of influence in the neighboring states who had obtained grants of lands under the actual government of that district. Even the states which brought forward claims in contradiction to ours seemed more solicitous to dismember this state than to establish their own pretensions. These were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. New Jersey and Rhode Island, upon all occasions, discovered a warm zeal for the independence of Vermont, and Maryland, till alarmed by the appearance of a connection between Canada and that state, entered deeply into the same views. These being small states saw an unfriendly eye the perspective of our growing greatness. In a review of these transactions, we may trace some of the causes. In a review of these transactions, we may trace some of the causes which would be likely to embroil the states with each other if it should be their unpropitious destiny to become disunited. So basically, I think he's just saying, like, here's all the motives that these states had that they could have fought with each other over these land grabs, but because they were part of a federal government, they didn't go to war with each other, which is good. The competitions of commerce would be another fruitful source of contention. The states less favorably circumstanced would be desirous of escaping from the disadvantages of local situation and of sharing in the advantages of their more fortunate neighbors. Each state or separate confederacy would pursue a system of commercial policy peculiar to itself. This would occasion distinctions, preferences, and exclusions which would beget discontent. The habits of intercourse on the basis of equal privileges, to which we have been accustomed since the earliest settlement of the country, would give a keener edge to those causes of discontent than they would naturally have independent of this circumstance. In all caps, he spams, we should be ready to denominate injuries those things which were in reality the justifiable acts of independent sovereignties consulting a distinct interest. Injuries, those things which are in reality the just. We should be ready to denominate injuries those things which were in reality the justifiable acts of independent sovereign consulting a distinct interest. We should be ready to denominate. So we should be willing to say that there was a party, I guess, that was injured, even if that injury was the justifiable act of some other entity which had like an interest of its own, basically. Intercourse on the basis of equal privileges, which we've been accustomed since allies. Can you actually those causes of discontent actually have independent circumstances? That's right. The spirit of enterprise, which characterizes the commercial part of America, has left no occasion of displaying itself unimproved. It is not at all probable that this unbridled spirit would pay much respect to those regulations of trade by which particular states might endeavor to secure exclusive benefits to their own citizens. The infractions of these regulations on one side, the efforts to prevent and repel them on the other, would naturally lead to outrages, and these to reprisals and wars. Basically, that each state would be self-interested and they would make like deals with each other and other people and would violate deals or whatever that would be more favorable to them than to other states or confederacies, I guess, right? The opportunities which some states would have of rendering others tributary to them by commercial regulations would be impatiently submitted to by the tributary states. The relative situation of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey would afford an example of this kind. New York, from the necessities of revenue, must lay duties on her importations. A great part of these duties must be paid by the inhabitants of the two other states in the capacity of consumers of what we import. Look, even they understood that tariffs were just a tax on the end consumer. New York would neither be willing nor able to forego this advantage. Her citizens would not consent that a duty paid by them should be remitted in favor of the citizens of her neighbors, nor would it be practical, if there were not this impediment in the way, to distinguish the customers in our own markets. Would Connecticut and New Jersey long submit to be taxed by New York for her exclusive benefit? Should we be long permitted to remain in the quiet and undisturbed enjoyment of a metropolis, from the possessions of which we derived an advantage so odious to our neighbors and, in their opinion, so oppressive? Should we be able to preserve it against the incumbent weight of Connecticut on the one side and the cooperating pressure of New Jersey on the other? These are questions that temerity alone will answer in the affirmative. Basically saying that like they enjoy a particular type of rent, basically that they have access to these ports and control these ports, and that the neighbors around them are probably going to go to war with them and fight over it if they're not going to be happy having things like imported that they're going to have to pay a tax on and everything, right? Hold on one second. Okay. The public debt of the Union would be a further cause of collision between the separate states or confederacies. The apportionment in the first instance and the progressive extinguishment afterward would be alike productive of ill humor and animosity. How would it be possible to agree upon a rule of apportionment satisfactory to all? There is scarcely any that can be proposed which is entirely free from real objections. Talking about the debt that the Union has incurred, how would you divvy it up amongst the states if they decided to become disunionized? These, as usual, would be exaggerated by the adverse interest of the parties. There are even dissimilar views among the states as to the general principle of discharging the public debt. Some of them, either less impressed with the importance of national credit, or because their citizens have little, if any, immediate interest in the question, feel an indifference, if not a repugnance, to the payment of the domestic debt at any rate. These would be inclined to magnify the difficulties of a distribution. Others of them, a numerous body of whose citizens are creditors to the public, beyond proportion of the state in the total amount of the national debt, would be strenuous for some equitable and effective provision. The procrastinations of the former would excite the resentments of the latter. The settlement of a rule would, in the meantime, be postponed by real differences of opinion and affected delays. The citizens of the states interested would clamor, foreign powers would urge for the satisfaction of their just demands, and the peace of the states would be hazarded to the double contingency of external invasion and internal contention. Basically, some people have lent money to the Union, some people have borrowed from the Union, or the Union has borrowed money, and there'd be like a disagreement between how to even settle these debts afterwards. Let's see, all of this was 7. He also argues that the debt assumed by the Union would be impossible to fairly apportion. It would lead to a great deal of conflict. Suppose the difficulties of agreeing upon a rule surmounted, and the apportionment made. Still, there is great room to suppose that the rule agreed upon would, upon experiment, be found to bear harder upon some states than upon others. Those which were sufferers by it would naturally seek for a mitigation of the burden. The others would as naturally be disinclined to a revision, which was likely to end in an increase of their own encumbrances. The refusal would be too plausible a pretext to the complaining states to withhold their contributions, not to be embraced with avidity, and the non-compliance of these states with their engagements would be a ground of bitter discussion and altercation. If even the rule adopted should in practice justify the equality of its principle, still delinquencies in payments on the parts of some of these states would result from a diversity of other causes, the real deficiency of resources, the mismanagement of their finances, accidental disorders in the management of the government, and, in addition to the rest, the reluctance with which men commonly part with money for purposes that have outlived the exigencies which produce them and interfere with the supply of immediate wants. Basically, there's a whole bunch of reasons why people wouldn't pay shit back, and it would fuck shit up. Delinquencies from whatever causes would be productive of complaints, recriminations, and quarrels. There is perhaps nothing more likely to disturb the tranquility of nations than their being bound to mutual contributions for any common object that does not yield an equal and coincident benefit. For it is an observation, as true as it is trite, that there is nothing men differ so readily about as the payment of money. Laws in violation of private contracts, as they amount to aggressions on the rights of those states whose citizens are injured by them, may be considered as another probable source of hostility. We are not authorized to expect that a more liberal or more equitable spirit would preside over the legislations of the individual states hereafter. If unrestrained by any additional checks, then we have heretofore seen, in too many instances, disgracing their several codes. We have observed the disposition to retaliation excited in Connecticut in consequence of the enormities perpetuated by the legislature of Rhode Island, and we reasonably infer that, in similar cases, under other circumstances, a war, not of parchment but of the sword, would chastise such atrocious breaches of moral obligation and social justice. Basically, that states wouldn't give fair trials, I guess, to fair trials to other citizens of other states if they had like issues with them, and basically just like, we need to work together or all of our shit's gonna be fucked, I guess. Right? The probability of incompatible alliances between the different states of confederacies and different foreign nations, and the effects of this situation upon the peace of the whole, have been sufficiently unfolded in some preceding papers. From the view they have exhibited of this part of the subject, this conclusion is to be drawn that America, if not connected at all, or only by the feeble tie of a simple league, offensive and defensive, would, by the operation of such jarring alliances, be gradually entangled in all the pernicious labyrinths of European politics and wars, and by the destructive contentions of the parts into which she was divided, would be likely to become a prey to the artifices and machinations of powers equally the enemies of them all. Divide et impera must be the motto of every nation that either hates or fears us. Basically, like, look at Europe. These guys trade, they do all this other shit, but guess what? They still fucking fight all the time. Why the fuck are we going to divide ourselves up like the European losers have? If we do that, we're going to fuck ourselves. Listen, every single external enemy that we have, all of them know that the only way to conquer us is to divide us. So divide, divide et impera must be the motto of every nation that either hates or fears us. I don't know what this stands for, but I'm guessing like divide and conquer or something. Oh, divide and command. There we go. Emerge in America if the United States were to break apart into multiple confederacies. He outlined what will be your dismissal as a country. Divide and conquer, it's a precept. I don't know what you mean by that. Dismissal as a country? I think you just outlined what would cause the country to, or what would cause everything to fuck up, basically. Okay. Do I have time to read this in 12 minutes? Federalist number 8. Sure. Okay. The consequences of hostilities between the states. Assuming It therefore, as an established truth that the several states, in case of disunion or such combinations of them as might happen to be formed out of the wreck of the general confederacy, would be subject to those vicissitudes of peace and war, of friendship and enmity with each other, which have fallen to the lot of all neighboring nations, not united under one government, let us enter into a concise detail of some of the consequences that would attend such a situation. So basically saying, like, we know that we're going to fight if we don't form a union, and here's what's going to happen if we do fight, okay? War between the states in the first period of their separate existence would be accompanied with much greater distresses than it commonly is in those countries where regular military establishments have long obtained. The disciplined armies always kept on foot on the continent of Europe, though they bear a malignant aspect to liberty and economy, have, notwithstanding, been productive of the signal advantage of rendering sudden conquests impracticable and of preventing that rapid desolation which used to mark the progress of war prior to their introduction. The art of fortification has contributed to the same ends. The nations of Europe are encircled with chains of fortified places which mutually obstruct invasion. Campaigns are wasted in reducing 2 or 3 frontier garrisons to gain admittance into an enemy's country. Similar impediments occur at every step to exhaust the strength and delay the progress of an invader. Formerly, an invading army would penetrate into the heart of a neighboring country almost as soon as intelligence of its approach could be received. But now a comparatively small force of disciplined troops acting on the defensive with the aid of posts is able to impede and finally to frustrate the enterprises of one much more considerable. The history of war in that quarter of the globe is no longer a history of nations subdued and empires overturned, but of towns taken and retaken, of battles that decide nothing, of retreats more beneficial than victories, of much effort and little acquisition. So he's saying that, like, listen, Europe, they've built forts, they've got whole lines of fortifications and garrisons. When these guys go to war with each other, it's not like they can do much damage, right? They basically fight with each other back and forth, blah, 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 or whatever. That's what he's saying. This essay argues for how catastrophic a war would be in the newly formed American Confederates were they to break apart. In this country, the scene would be altogether reversed. The jealousy of military establishments would postpone them as long as possible. The want of fortifications, leaving the frontiers of one state open to another, would facilitate inroads. The populous states would, with little difficulty, overrun their less populous neighbors. Conquest would be as easy to be made as difficult to be retained. War, therefore, would be desultory and predatory. Plunder and devastation ever march in the train of irregulars. The calamities of individuals would make the principal figure in the events which would characterize our military exploits. This picture is not too highly wrought, though I confess it would not long remain a just one. Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. Even the ardent love of liberty will, after a time, give way to its dictates. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel nations the most attached to liberty to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become more willing to run the risk of being less free. That's a good quote. The institutions chiefly alluded to are standing armies and the correspondent appendages of military establishments. Standing armies, it is said, are not provided against in the new Constitution, and it is therefore inferred that they may exist under it. There exist enumerated powers, remember? Their existence, however, from the very terms of the proposition, is, at most, problematical and uncertain. But standing armies, it may be replied, must inevitably result from a dissolution of the Confederacy. Frequent war and constant apprehension, which require a state of as constant preparation, will infallibly produce them. The weaker states or confederacies would first have recourse to them to put themselves upon an equality with their more potent neighbors. They would endeavor to supply the inferiority of population and resources by a more regular and effective system of defense, by disciplined troops, and by fortifications. They would at the same time be necessitated to strengthen the executive arm of government, in doing which their constitutions would acquire a progressive direction toward monarchy. It is of the nature of war to increase the executive at the expense of the legislative authority. Basically saying that like smaller confederacies would have to become more and more militarized in order to maintain their security against the larger confederacies. Just bad things would happen. The expedients which have been mentioned would soon give the states or confederacies that made use of them a superiority over their neighbors. Small states, or states of less natural strength, under vigorous governments and with the assistance of disciplined armies, have often triumphed over large states, or states of greater natural strength, which have been destitute of these advantages. Neither the pride nor the safety of the more important states or confederacies would permit them long to submit to this mortifying and adventitious superiority. They would quickly resort to means similar to those by which it had been effected to reinstate themselves in their lost preeminence. Thus, we should, in a little time, see established in every part of this country the same engines of despotism which have been the scourge of the old world. This, at least, would be the natural course of things, and our reasonings will be the most likely to be just in proportion as they are accommodated to this standard. So little states will make armies because they're afraid of being conquered by big states. Big states will make armies because they don't want to be conquered by more prepared smaller states, and it's all a big arms race until everybody's fucking each other over, basically. These are not vague inferences drawn from supposed or speculative defects in a constitution, the whole power of which is lodged in the hands of the people, or their representatives and delegates, but they are solid conclusions drawn from the natural and necessary progress of human affairs. It may perhaps be asked, by way of objection to this, why did not standing armies spring up out of the contentions which so often distracted the ancient republics of Greece? Different answers, equally satisfactory, may be given to this question. The industrious habits of the people of the present day, absorbed in the pursuit of gain and devoted to the improvements of agriculture and commerce, are incompatible with the condition of a nation of soldiers, which was the true condition of the people of those republics. The means of revenue, which have been so greatly multiplied by the increase of gold and silver, and of the arts of industry and the science of finance, which is the offspring of modern times, concurring with the habits of nations, have produced an entire revolution in the system of war, and have rendered disciplined armies, distinct from the body of the citizens, the inseparable companions of frequent hostility. I think he's saying that, like, well, so somebody might counter and say, okay, well, hold on, what about like Greece? Like, there were tons of different states and people around here, and they didn't make armies and conquer each other all the time. And he's saying, well, sure, but like back then, like if you were a man who could be in a military, you were probably out farming, or you had to do like other things. But now we've got massive industry, we have multiplicative wealth, we can do so many things. People have way more time to basically become part of a military and kill each other, I think, right? There is a wide difference also between military establishments in a country seldom exposed by its situation to internal invasions, and in one which is often subject to them and always apprehensive of them. The rulers of the former can have a good pretext, if they are so inclined, to keep on foot armies so numerous as must of necessity be maintained in the latter. These armies being, in the first case, rarely, if at all, called into activity for interior defense, the people are in no danger of being broken to military subordination. The laws are not accustomed to relaxations. Greece at this point was under Ottoman control. Greece was seen in an idealized realm of type of... Oh, gotcha, okay. In favor of military exigencies, the civil state remains in full vigor, neither corrupted nor confounded with the principles or propensities of the other state. The smallness of the army renders the natural strength of the community an overmatch for it, and the citizens, not habituated to look up to the military power for protection or to submit to its oppressions, neither love nor fear the soldiery. They view them with a spirit of jealous acquiescence in a necessary evil and stand ready to resist a power which they suppose may be exerted to the prejudice of their rights. The army under such circumstances may usefully aid the magistrate to suppress a small faction or an occasional mob or insurrection, but it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of the great body of the people. So basically, like, I think this is just talking about it would be impossible to keep a small army to maintain the population because people wouldn't be happy if there was a big army, and a small army wouldn't be able to stop the people from rebelling or whatever. I guess. I don't know. It's kind of what this is talking about. We're almost done with this. Fuck, hold on. Peace Coast coming. Shh. 5 paragraphs. 4. In a country in the predicament last described, the contrary of all this happens. The perpetual menacings of danger oblige the government to be always prepared to repel it. Its armies must be numerous enough for instant defense. So this is saying, so the country would keep a much larger army to be able to fight off insurrecting population. The continual necessity for their services enhances the importance of the soldier and proportionally degrades the condition of the citizen. The military state becomes elevated above the civil. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subjected to frequent infringements on their rights, which serve to weaken their sense of those rights, and by degrees the people are brought to consider the soldiery not only as their protectors but as their superiors. The transition from this disposition to that of considering them masters is neither remote nor difficult, but it is very difficult to prevail upon a people under such impressions to make a bold or effectual resistance to usurpation supported by the military power. The Kingdom of Great Britain falls within the first description, an insular situation and a powerful marine guarding it in a great measure against the possibility of foreign invasion supersede the necessity of a numerous army within the kingdom. A sufficient force to make head against a sudden descent till the militia could have time to rally and embody is all that has been deemed requisite. No motive of national policy is demanded, nor would public opinion have tolerated a larger number of troops upon its domestic establishment. There has been for a long time past little room for the operation of the other causes, which has been enumerated as the consequences of internal war. This peculiar felicity of situation has, in a great degree, contributed to preserve the liberty which that country to this day enjoys, in spite of the prevalent venality and corruption. If, on the contrary, Britain had been situated on the continent and had been compelled, as she would have been by that situation, to make her military establishments at home coextensive with those of the other great powers of Europe, she, like them, would in all probability be at this day a victim to the absolute power of a single man. Tis possible, though not easy, that the people of that island may be enslaved from other causes, but it cannot be by the prowess of an army so inconsiderable as that which has been usually kept up within the kingdom. Sorry, I'm almost done here. So because Britain is one of the things, the island of Great Britain has unified into a single country. They don't have to keep like all these internal armies to fight with each other and all this. And because of their unity, the people enjoy basically more freedoms and aren't being stripped from them as a result of having to keep a giant military state, basically. If we are wise enough to preserve the Union, we may for ages enjoy an advantage similar to that of an insulated situation. Europe is at a great distance from us. Her colonies in our vicinity will be likely to continue too much disproportion in strength to be able to give us any dangerous annoyance. Extensive military establishment cannot, in this position, be necessary to our security. But if we should be disunited and the integral parts should either remain separated or, which is most probable, should be thrown together into 2 or 3 confederacies, we should be, in a short course of time, in the predicament of the continental powers of Europe. Our liberties would be a prey to the means of defending ourselves against the ambition and jealousy of each other. This is an idea not superficial or futile, but solid and weighty. It deserves the most serious and mature consideration of every prudent and honest man of whatever party. If such men will make a firm and solemn pause, and meditate dispassionately on the importance of this interesting idea, if they will contemplate it in all its attitudes and trace it to all its consequences, they will not hesitate to part with trivial objections to a constitution, the rejection of which would, in all probability, put a final period to the Union. The airy phantoms that flit before the distempered imaginations of some of its adversaries would quickly give place to the more substantial forms of dangers, real, certain, and formidable. Jesus. Okay. This is number 8. If states were constantly warring with one another and had larger armies, then freedoms of its citizens would necessarily be curtailed, and the soldiery and militaries be seen as superior to the ordinary citizens, and the states would be dedicating a large amount of their resources and leadership to simply maintaining their militaries. Okay.